Blah.
Perfect.
Hello, everyone. I'm Cory,
And I'm Isaac.
and we are going to talk about movies.
We're really getting into a rhythm on that, I think.
Yeah. The movie we want to talk about today is Blinded by the Light.
Okay, so the trailers for this film really emphasized one key element of it, I think, which is its connection to the music of Bruce Springsteen. And that's definitely a big part of this film, which is a chronicle of the adolescent life of a British Pakistani teenager. I guess what other kind of life does a teenager have than an adolescent one?
Yeah. And the other key connection point that you might have seen is that it's directed and co-written by Gurinder Chadha, who directed
Bend It Like
Bend It
Beckham.
Like Beckham. There
And
we
in
go.
fact, I noticed that one of the production companies listed here is Bend It Productions,
Oh,
which
yeah,
I'm
clever.
assuming was a production company founded by her, although I actually don't know about that. I should look that up. So this film is directed by Gurinder Chadha, as Cory mentioned, who is a British Indian filmmaker, but she was born in Kenya.
Yes. Of Indian
But she
descent.
has spent most of her life in Britain, is a British citizen, and is in fact in OBE, Order of the British Empire, one of those British
Yeah.
royal medals. Didn't quite make the cut for knighthood, but pretty solid in the Queen's eyes.
What is the female version of knighthood?
Dame.
Dame, that's
Damehood.
right. Yeah, Dame. I don't know
Yes.
if it's called that, but yeah. So anyway, you have to wonder how much connection she had to the story initially, and I don't think we'll know without a specific interview.
Which we'll have next week. Yeah,
Yeah,
bringing her on.
we're gonna interview her.
After, as long as we
Um,
blow up enough, guys. So we really need your support. You need to share
Yeah,
this.
we're
or else-
trying to get both her and the original dude whose
Bruce
name
Springsteen?
is Bruce
yeah.
Springsteen. No, sorry for us fans who wrote the
No.
book that this movie is based off of. The connection between both of them is that they're both British, grew up in England, but are also of an Asian descent. So,
Mhm.
I mean, I assume that is why she got initially interested in the film, because a lot of her movies, right, are about Indian women living in Britain.
Mhm.
So she's obviously tied in a lot of probably her own experience or her own observance of what's going on in her upbringing.
A lot of what's depicted of Javed's childhood, who's the main character played by Vivi Kara, is the historically grounded experience of a Pakistani youth living at a time when there was a whole lot of bigotry and hatred directed at outsiders and immigrants, and specifically those of Pakistani origin in Britain. And
That's a
there
good point.
are a lot of marches. There's one white supremacy march that transpires during an important narrative point in the film. And there's a lot of depictions of just the day-to-day discrimination faced by Javed and his family as Pakistani immigrants who are now long since British citizens, and Javed and his siblings pretty clearly identify as being British and yet are very far from being free from this form of prejudice. And that whole element of the film feels hyper relevant in today's climate in America, with the vitriol that's directed towards immigrants. Anyway, that's the socio-political backdrop that this film transpires in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so for those unfamiliar, basically the plot is, with all of that political context in the background, the main character, Javed, he discovers the music of Bruce Springsteen, and it opens his eyes to the world and to himself. And he discovers, or I should say, finds confidence in himself, in his own writing, in his own abilities, in finding his passion. So it's kind of your classic setup to a feel-good coming-of-age type story with all of that in the background.
Mm-hmm. Right. So the beginning of the film is this childhood snapshot where Javed and his best friend Matt are innocently frolicking through a field. They're on their bikes, and they are talking about how they're going to be friends forever. And the final shot of the film also is a horrifically poorly acted, in my opinion, shot of the same young Javed smiling after the entire arc of his present, or not present day, but 1987 existence is chronicled within the film. So yeah, so the film is bookended by those scenes of young Javed.
Right, we don't ever get to see him leave, but we get the understanding that at the beginning he's stuck in Luton, which England, that's the area that they're in, and at the end he is leaving. While we don't get to see it on screen, we know that that's kind of come full circle.
So the optimism of his past self is in that way gratified.
So I think there's not a lot of like important plot points that are gonna like spoil things here, so I think we can just get on right to our initial impressions on this. So
right.
You already mentioned that you thought that was kind of poorly acted, so can you speak on that a little more?
Yeah, I can't speak on that point a whole lot more, except to say if you watch the kids
like,
smile in the last shot of this movie,
but like,
it's hard to take seriously.
First impression.
Yeah, so Javed's best friend Matt, who's played by Dean Charles Chapman, is presented initially as what you might assume to be a very important figure in the film. The line of dialogue that the opening sequence fades out on is Javed saying, "We're going to be best friends forever," in this way that makes you just certain that that belief is going to be crushed by the film's events.
Yeah, I thought that same thing.
And yet we pick up how many years in the future? Maybe seven years in the future, and Matt and Javed have already grown apart. Matt is more or less a background figure in the film who appears a few times for comic relief and does have a degree of development in terms of his support for Javed, but it really feels like the majority of what's important between these two characters has already happened by the time the film picks up, and in my opinion, his inclusion is a little bit puzzling. I have trouble coming up with anything that he brings to the film that's actually meaningful or substantial.
In fact, his one moment of emotional display seemed kind of forced to me. Like, it seemed unnecessary and even questionable from a writing standpoint why it was included. Because
was that the part where he gets mad at Javed?
Yeah, well, it kind of has the emotional, like crying moment that he realizes that he shouldn't have been so hard on Matt or something. Like, he tries to go into his house and then his neighbor says a good friend should be listened to, and then he goes back and goes, "I'm sorry, blah, blah, blah." As if that never had happened before, where Javed's voice was completely gone because he's racially discriminated against in his whole life. So, yeah, it seemed odd to include that to me.
I agree. It didn't feel like Matt was enough of a character to the point where you could really identify with what he was feeling.
Or even use it as a stance or a talking point on racial politics.
Yeah, it felt irrelevant.
Yeah.
And Matt's entire character feels fairly irrelevant because even in terms of just being a supportive friend to Javed, he is replaced pretty quickly by this character Roops, who is also of Asian descent, and he introduces Javed to the music of Bruce Springsteen, and then proceeds to smile and run happily through various scenes with him and serve no other purpose whatsoever.
Yeah, I mean, that might be a little overcritical, but I see what you're saying.
I mean, I really see very little that's done with this character. Like, is there anything else that...
No, yeah, he is just kind of a catalyst for his discovery.
Yeah.
But, I mean, they showed him at the end, the real Roops, right? His real family, too, so...
I struggled to care, though, because I only identified Roops as the person that showed Javed the Bruce Springsteen tapes.
I think there was an element of shared fandom in there. There was an element of the knowledge that they were going to be lifelong friends. They kind of hinted on that at the end, right? They didn't have a very tearful goodbye. They just had a friendly chat and Bruce kind of situation, right? Where they were still bonded over Bruce Springsteen and they had just gone on this trip together. So
still buddies.
Yeah, still buddies.
You have that. I suppose you have that contrasted a bit with the relationship that Javed has with Matt, which seems pretty clearly presented as one where they are destined to grow apart.
Yeah, it's almost like he was using him to write lyrics because he knew he was a good poet.
Yeah.
And was just trying to find, or just lazy in terms of his own writing, so was just relying on his friend, or his childhood friend, to do that for him.
Right.
And write his essays for school and stuff.
Yeah. I think that talking about these two characters it's a nice microcosm for the problem for me with a lot of the side characters in this film, which is just that there are a lot of them and very few of them. In fact, I'm going to argue only one of them really feels fleshed out to an adequate extent, and I'm referring to Javed's father, played by Kulvinder Gir, who is certainly the most important character in Javed's life. Do you want to speak on that a little?
And the story overall, I would say. The father-son relationship builds pretty much everything that we need in the tension and anxiety in a feel-good movie. He starts off as this stern and loving to an extent, but stuck in his ways, very traditionalist, worried about losing his culture, as a lot of first-generation immigrants are. So Javed and his dad's relationship throughout the film drives what makes a lot of his decisions, ultimately trying to either impress his dad, so to speak, stay connected to his family, or to be so frustrated and angry with their traditionalism and their misunderstanding of him that it drives them apart completely, only to be rejoined at the end.
Right.
That tension has to be strong enough, and that relationship has to be strong enough in order to drive the whole film, and I think it's fairly successful to a degree. Both characters are acted very well, and both are portrayed with enough complexity that we see both specific elements to the characters that make them unique and also universal elements that we can identify. So that makes it kind of the classic success for a feel-good film.
Definitely, and I agree with you. I think that there's enough there. We get the sense, despite all the aggravation, that there's a lot of love between those two characters that's conveyed very naturally just by the way they're both acted and interact with each other. And I think you can say the same for Javed's mother as well, in terms of the relationship that you see she has with her husband and the marital difficulties that are depicted in the film, but in a very brief and natural way.
Yeah, there wasn't a lot of opportunity for the actress who played his mom to really come out and do anything, but when she did, it was welcome and it seemed natural.
Right, that's Mira Ganatra. Then there's also Javed's sister, whose name is Shazia, who is played by Nikita Mehta, and is puzzlingly not listed on the Wikipedia page.
Yeah, we thought that was weird.
Yeah, we had to dive into the IMDb to find her name. I know that I felt that there was some potential in this character. It felt like her relationship with her brother was interesting, and their kinship, their sort of getting to know each other and realizing how similar their experiences have been growing up in this climate where they have been encouraged to embrace their family's tradition, but have also had a lot of interest in the outside world that they've grown up in, and they both seem to clearly identify as being British. They both show similar rebellious teenage traits. They have a very supportive relationship with each other that I feel could have been better presented, but there's just simply too many side characters in this film, and ultimately Shazia doesn't get enough time to support her brother or him to support her, because there's these other characters who don't go anywhere, who are also taking up time.
Yeah, and almost to me seemed like a tool to show that you could still identify very closely with your culture and tradition, right, in using music to dance to with your friends that is from Pakistani or at least some Southern Asian descent, and also having fun without having to break away from that culture entirely, which is what Javed does when he takes all this American influence from Bruce Springsteen.
So that core arc that Javed and his father undergo over the course of the film, as you said, it's what drives the entire narrative conflict. And that conflict is more or less Javed breaking out of the cultural norms that are set by his father and his family in terms of the career that his father wants him to have versus that which he wants, and in general the kind of life that he wants to live, right, versus the kind that his father has pre-selected for him. And the way that that conflict is resolved is through what is just one of the laziest narrative devices known to man, which is the off-the-cuff speech by the main character that resolves all of the tension in the film and makes everyone love each other again.
Yeah.
It just had me rolling my eyes, and also, in my opinion, it just completely undersells the complexity of the entire situation.
one thing that I loved about the film was it's that father-son relationship, the way that it was built up over the course of the film, slowly and steadily, so that you knew that there was going to be some kind of explosion, so to speak, right? It's building, and their small interaction is very frustrating for Javed, but he never shows it because he hasn't really come out of his shell. And then there's this final turning point, the classic about 2/3 to midway through, where he kind of explodes on his dad and yells at him and says all the classic things like, you know, I didn't ask you to be born, or I didn't ask you to be born. You know, I don't remember the exact wording, but the same thing that they say in all coming-of-age films.
Mm-hmm.
But the end scene is just so classically set up that you feel like you've already seen it and know exactly what's going to happen. Not to say that you didn't know exactly what was going to happen earlier, but when you can find exact things in a scene that you know you've seen before, like the starts reading the written speech, stops midway to say, oh, my view on this has changed actually very minutely. And in the middle of that, your family walks in unexpectedly to view it, and you just continue on, through
tears.
Yeah, through tears.
And
exactly.
Have this incredibly eloquent, unplanned speech that is better than the essay that you had planned to read at the beginning.
Yeah. It was
ugh.
It was ugh, for sure.
I think a lot of this film for me, it felt lurchy. It felt inconsistent. It felt like there were scenes that were really tapping into complex and meaningful emotional explorations of the characters. And then there were other scenes that just felt designed solely to advance the plot or convey one very specific idea, and the scenes were short. For instance, Javed's entire trip to New Jersey to see the hometown of Bruce Springsteen, which he won in an essay contest, and then it just boiled down to basically a montage sequence of his American vacation with Roops. It really brings nothing to the table except to emphasize how much Javed loves Bruce Springsteen, which is something that was already made very clear over the course of the film. So, like, there's just these inserts that throw the entire rhythm of the narrative off.
And it almost seems that, like, ultimately, Bruce Springsteen, it isn't as much of, like, an important aspect, or it shouldn't have been as much as an important aspect, and was rather just a catalyst for a lot of things that happen. I mean, at the end, the last speech, it didn't strike me that Bruce Springsteen was really, like, informing a lot of it as much as just he was able to put his own interpretation into it about his life that was relatively similar to what Bruce was initially talking about.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think this is where we get into what's really interesting about this movie, which is how it uses Javed's love for Bruce Springsteen and how it depicts his admiration for that artist.
Yeah, so it's almost like there's two completely separate things going on, right? There's this film about classic immigrant father-son relationship where he's trying to do his own thing and his parents are still trying to hold on to their more traditional ways. And there's also this element of experiencing fandom for the first time.
What's more important than Bruce Springsteen himself being the idol that Javed looks up to is the fact that Javed has this musical idol at all. And that's an experience that I think we can all relate to, imbuing the lyrics and music of a great artist with our own emotions and
their own personal meaning.
Yes, our own experiences and emotions inform the meaning that we interpret an artist's lyrics to have. So it doesn't really matter specifically what Bruce Springsteen's lyrics are. What matters is what they mean to Javed and how they help him cope with this incredibly difficult period of his life and guide him and make him feel a little less alone, more or less, which is something that I think almost all of us can relate to. And attention, I think, is drawn to the fact that Javed is imbuing these songs with his own meaning by the lyrics that show up on screen, because sometimes certain lyrics from Bruce Springsteen's songs actually pop up when they are said by Springsteen in the film. And at certain points, specific words pop up. Absent are the sentences that those words are actually found in. It simply chooses to highlight a couple of words from the lyrics,
right?
Like,
the most emotionally resonant, right? We hear
with
the song,
Javed,
yeah,
right?
exactly. We hear the song playing in the background when there's some dialogue, but then when the important lyrics come up, we go back to it.
Yeah, and it's like, okay, here's the parts of these lyrics that are really resonating with Javed. It's It's a very interesting, actually, visual tool in order to simulate the internal experience of the main character and give us, as viewers, an idea of realizing what this character's experience of this music is. Whereas usually we're very much bound to our own subjective experiences of music unless we are studying it critically. In this film, we're able to instead simulate the experience of listening to Bruce Springsteen as Javed, if that makes sense.
I think that's a really good point. I think it says something that both Isaac and I thought that this movie could have easily been done with a different character, with different lyrics, with, you know, different artists that we loved, and yet still worked perfectly fine, because it speaks to this universal aspect of people who love music. It helps you discover things about yourself and about life that you didn't really get from just even experiencing life to an extent. There's an extra layer in there that we are able, for some reason, to put ourselves into. The first thing I thought of was how much I was taken with the lyrics of Maynard James Keenan from the band Tool and A Perfect Circle the first time that I heard them. That was one of the first bands that I ever loved, and their lyrics especially, I loved, you know, the heavy guitars because I'm a guitarist, but the lyrics themselves I was so taken with for some reason, right? It was more than just reading it off a page. It was somebody like saying it from the heart, somebody saying something poetic and beautiful from somewhere deep inside that I didn't really understand existed. And I mean, I think you could probably speak to another artist that you love, right?
Yeah, I totally relate. Hashtag relatable. I think the first example that comes to mind for me is Arcade Fire. Specifically, my anecdote here is the song Sprawl 2, which I had this really profound emotional experience with when I was about Javed's age, where I ascribed the lyrics of that song, which are actually sort of about the suburban sprawl of America. But for me, the song became about my first trip outside of the country. It was a school trip to Japan, and I was incredibly excited for it and was just really ready to have my perspective opened up and to escape the hometown that I'd been living in for my entire life, even though I was hardly trapped there or experiencing anything close to the sort of plight that Javed finds himself in as an immigrant in Britain in 1987. But I still ascribed that song with this hope of escaping for 3 weeks.
That is exactly why Javed, like you said, finds his own meaning there, because the songs like The Promised Land and Born to Run are about escape, and he wanted to escape what he was currently in. He wanted to get out, and that's not all the songs are about. They're actually about a lot more complicated things, right? He even mentions in the film the classic thing that everybody knows about Born in the USA, that it's actually about Vietnam vets being treated horribly, and when they come back to America, not being appreciated and whatnot. So he knows of that aspect, but more importantly to him, and more importantly to the film, is that personal element that means something specific to him.
Mm-hmm. I really like how the film depicts that aspect of Javed's experience, because it really is just dumb luck that Javed happens upon Bruce Springsteen. He's introduced to him by the character Roops, who initially approaches him just because he sees that they're of similar descent, and that's a rare thing to see in the school that they attend in Britain. So he sort of randomly introduces Javed to Springsteen, and then Javed just happens to absolutely love Springsteen's music and lyrics.
The other thing, right, is that the kind of music that strikes you, it seems, is always coming at a critical point in your life. It's coming at a point for him in the film where he feels like he's about to abandon everything that he's put down in his own voice.
Right.
And when he hears Bruce Springsteen singing from the heart, it actually is him hearing his own words from his own heart, from his own brain, right? When he turns in those same pages to his teacher, she describes them as raw and his real voice. I mean, that's what he's hearing, and it's at a very crucial part in the film. So, like you said, it's dumb luck, but it's also almost destiny that it couldn't have happened at a more important or better time for him.
Right. But perhaps was his obsession with Bruce Springsteen a little bit catalyzed by the fact that he needed something to latch onto at that moment.
Yeah,
he needed that form
exactly.
of support. And
it's both. Yeah, it's both. It's not actual destiny, obviously. It's both an element of chance and a psychological desire to find meaning in relatively ambiguous words.
But that isn't to take anything away from it, because
Right,
that's an experience that so many of us have had, and so many of us can attest to as being very powerful.
Yeah. It's one of those classic things that, like, we're having so much trouble putting in words, but we know that everyone has experienced this to some degree.
Mm-hmm. And that is what the film is so good at depicting, in my opinion. I have never seen a movie that captures that spirit of fandom quite like Blinded by the Light does.
I agree.
And it does that in a way that occasionally is overblown, but to an extent that feels very self-aware. There's this,
Agreed, right?
Running through town sequence set to Born to Run, where Javed, his girlfriend, and Roops are running through the streets carefree and
singing along, right?
Singing along.
Yeah, that was the other interesting thing is, right, it was almost musical-like in that you could hear their voices as they were singing.
Yeah, during a couple scenes it is, and the one where Javed is attempting to woo Eliza.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
In the public market area, and he starts singing. I'm not sure which song that was, do you know?
That might have been Hungry Heart. I actually can't remember at this point.
But he starts singing a Bruce Springsteen song to her in the middle of this crowded public square, and then eventually it leads to some of the people joining in with him in this, like you said, almost as if it's a musical number.
Mm-hmm.
But then also some of the people, like his friend Matt, are looking around dumbfounded, as if to say, what is happening here? Why are you all singing? This is insane. So there's this balance where the film almost becomes this fantastical musical, but also reminds you enough that it's grounded in real world experience to still resonate as being genuine. It's this cartoonish depiction of something many of us have done ourselves in life, which is to sort of picture ourselves at this important moment in our life with this song that we love as the soundtrack that's like playing while we carry out some action, right? I know I've done that.
And it even shows to some extent, right, that he imagines him and his future girlfriend, dancing around, right? They show a little like saturated video that's like his imagination of that happening. So yeah, that's exactly, I think, what that's describing for sure.
Right. So you can read it as being just super sappy and corny and hyperbolic, but that's kind of the point, because really many of us, I think, have been at a point where we have more or less participated in something just like that, even if a little bit more of it was in our heads in real life, right? The film brings that out visually on the big screen and shows you the feeling that you've probably had in your head before, but in connection to some other song that you love.
I mean, had that been in real life, Javed was never portrayed as a good singer in the film. So had he actually attempted that, or had, say, random person, you attempted that in real life, it probably wouldn't have gone over well, and you probably would have been laughed at, right? So it's not a realistic element, but it's not trying to be.
So my biggest point of praise for this film is that depiction of fandom, and I wish I was more into the narrative that it ties into, because I think that there was a whole lot of potential there, and that, like we were talking about before, the rhythm is interrupted, the focus feels off kilter.
Yeah, there's even like a couple like leaps of logic in the script, like the initial meetings of Roops and Javed. There's a moment where he just randomly says, "So what's the deal with the boss?" Right? Having no idea who this is, because he doesn't know much about popular music. He knows a little bit. Roops immediately goes into the quote from the trailer, which is, "Bruce is the direct line to all that's right in this shitty world," or whatever he says. And immediately Javed knows who he's talking about. He knows who Bruce is specifically. There's not any moment that would actually have happened in real life, right? It's really sped along, where he just immediately knows what he's talking about, is already skeptical of it. And there's a couple moments throughout that have that inconsistency, that jarring shift of pacing, that seem fast in some spots and then drawn out in others,
where it just feels like the narrative beat is off. It is a sudden lurch forward where the plot just needed to go somewhere, and so there's just this inserted scene where the characters immediately recognize what the next plot point needs to be, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, and I suppose you could view that introduction by Roops as an exaggerated version of being recommended a new artist by a friend, and then having that artist happen to immediately take. We could view it as a similar kind of thing as the exaggerated fandom stuff we were talking about earlier, where it's still kind of a relatable experience, even if it's depicted a bit hyperbolically.
It seems like it's not supposed to be, right? It seems like they're trying to portray it in a standard manner, or a dramatic manner.
Yeah, there's points when it's maybe just not taken far enough to be clearly cartoonish, and so it instead just comes across as unnatural.
The cinematography also seemed a little strange. Like, it was well portrayed, like what a smallish village in London looks like. But the thing that I thought was odd was they so heavy-handedly used the brightness and weather and look of everything to illustrate what Javed was feeling. It wasn't a cool, subtle thing that you noticed in a good film. It was a very heavy-handed, jarring alteration between gray and British to bright and sunny and joyful, running around in the hot sun, right? It was so stark to me that it didn't seem like they were even trying to be subtle.
There were points when I actually kind of dug that, like the scene when he loses all his papers and the Promised Land is playing. And
okay, that's that one I would say is an exception, because that seems just like a very well put together sequence.
It's like, oh my god, I can totally relate to feeling that melodramatic and like just being swept away, like feeling like there was this storm happening around me and just having all of my emotions zooming through my head while the lyrics of this song just blare in my ears. So even though we just talked about how Bruce Springsteen is kind of a stand-in for whatever artist you love and was influential in your life, there is still a lot of attention drawn to the specific figure of Springsteen.
It seems like the film didn't want to go too far into it. It wasn't like a horribly essential element, but it also still goes in far enough so that it feels significant. Mm-hmm. And to me, that middle ground, that kind of lukewarm aspect, seems like it should have gone either farther forward with it or farther back with it.
Right. It's not quite an ode to the music of Bruce Springsteen, but it's also not quite just a film featuring the music of Bruce Springsteen to drive home some emotional messages.
Yeah, it's almost like they tonally missed a little bit of what they probably could have done with that in either going to one semi-extreme, diving more deeply into his specific Bruce Springsteen love, or bringing that back to a more shallow aspect in order to focus on the other dramatic points of the film.
So why do you feel that way?
The reason why I feel that way is because they conveniently constructed the Bruce Springsteen music narrative in order to convey what they want to convey in the film. I don't think it matters a lot about an artist's life. Like, you can get super into an artist's music without ever knowing anything about them, so we can skip past that. But the music could have, had they wanted to go there, been far better constructed in terms of its actual narrative of what happened in those first 8 albums that came out before 1987. So, just to lay that out really quick, they really touched on the youthful exuberance, right? Especially initially, his feeling of the romantic boys is a thing that he talks about on his first album, Greetings from Asbury Park, and we get that element also in Javed's love for it in terms of the joy that it makes him feel. We also get in the film a little bit of the most important elements of Springsteen's music, which is its slightly more bitter views, but with some hope to them. Like, so the example that they use a lot, like you mentioned earlier, was Born to Run. They talk about how it has some hope, it has some
exuberance.
Yeah. So it has the exuberance also carried over from the earlier stuff, but it also has a more bitter view on the world. And how it does that specifically is it uses the characters that Springsteen's lyrics are famous for. The blue-collar New Jersey factory workers, like his dad, Springsteen's own dad, to convey the general 99% population of the United States, that kind of hardworking 70s, 80s view of you gotta, make your own way, and showing that as an aspect of a damning point in people's lives, right? That they're stuck in these jobs, using that as a criticism of the United States. Anyway, what they didn't go in far enough was that full-on despair, which is very crucial in the lyrics of Bruce Springsteen, not even mentioned at all. We get a little bitterness, we get a little angst. That's the right word, exactly. We get the angst because it's important for Javed's character, but we don't get a darkness that is found on Jungle Land, from Born to Run, even. It's found on Darkness on the Edge of Town, The River, where he talks about, the quote they even used from the movie was, "Is a dream a lie if it doesn't come true?" So diving into those characters more and more is what drove Springsteen to fully go over the edge on the album Nebraska, his 6th album, which showed the despair of his characters. I keep using that word because that's really the only word I can think of to describe it. Notice that we haven't talked about at all. It's conveniently entirely left out of the film. And that element I thought it was odd because they just kind of wrapped it all together into what happens with Born in the USA, which is showing those same characters again, right? Using all of the same ideas we talked about Born in the USA is about Vietnam vets, and there's My Hometown and Glory Days, and songs like that, which you can already guess what they're talking about from their titles. That is just shown as the surface level, which is that angst.
So, if I may respond to that, it seems to me there's a couple different ways you can view this. Way number one is that the film is cherry picking. It's selecting certain moments, certain moods from the discography of Bruce Springsteen. And it's applying the ones that work in Javed's experience to the film. Yeah. And then it's ignoring the ones where the arc doesn't line up correctly.
And this is going to sound silly, but the reason why it's frustrating to me a little bit is because it's played like he's listening to a Springsteen mixtape. It sounds like he's just getting the greatest hits, or at least the hits that are the most important for us. Whereas his actual listening experience, or what should have his character's actual experience be, is that holistic side of it. And that's what maybe couldn't have been portrayed in a movie because we have to hit only the highlights and the good music that they want to play. But for what would have probably been Manzoor, the guy who wrote the book, what probably was his full experience into that was more deep than the hits.
So I think that if the film had not gone quite so far in its depiction of the specific figure of Bruce Springsteen, then it might have been believable that our main character, Javed, just selected these songs himself. These were the songs that applied to his own experience, and so he cherry-picked the songs himself, just like many of us do when we listen to a song that fits our mood.
Yeah, exactly. You don't have to like a whole artist to love songs by them.
Right, like if an artist has a bleak second album that you skip over because you can't relate to it, that doesn't mean that you don't appreciate their music or anything. But the film goes far enough in depicting Springsteen himself as this important figure.
And depicting Javed as having an obsession with Bruce Springsteen. Right?
Yeah.
A healthy one, a normal love for his music obsession, but still, like, he must have had a complete collection. He had every album poster on his wall.
So then it feels like the film is neglecting a part of who that artist really was.
The other thing that doesn't fit into this tightly constructed narrative is the album that actually came out in 1987. The one that he was touring on at the time.
Which is the year the film takes place in.
The album that he was touring on was Tunnel of Love, which is back to that melancholy side. And even more love songs, despair songs that are more fleshed out, but not definitely a far cry from the anthemic and driving songs from Born to the USA.
Right. So someone's cherry picking here. It's either the film to make a more convenient narrative, or it's the character Javed to highlight his own personal experiences.
It's hard to say what the case is, because I don't know if you noticed this, but it's also co-written by Manzoor, the guy who wrote the book. So
yes,
it's hard to say exactly what they were trying to portray. And whatever it was, it didn't quite come across in terms of the full-on fandom versus more shallow aspects in order to focus on the dramatic elements.
Yeah, so what we end up with and what we already talked about to a fair extent, is this generalized depiction of fandom that is easy to apply to any artist that you have had that experience with, but one that is not a faithful representation of Bruce Springsteen holistically.
Mm-hmm.
So it becomes distracting if you try to read it as such.
Exactly. I mean, you would have to not in order for it to make sense in terms of the film's construction, right? You'd have to make yourself believe that he really was just more into the hits, right? More into the songs that fit his own style rather than a true, full-on fan like he's portrayed as.
And the movie is called Blinded by the Light. That is the title of a Bruce Springsteen song.
I mean, he
first
knew...
song of his first album.
Yeah, exactly. He goes as far to quote lines time after time from memory, so we know how deep this is in him.
Yeah.
And the way that that's then used as a tightly constructed narrative feels like they just didn't go enough in either direction, like we talked about. It's very middle ground.
Yeah, so perhaps Blinded by the Light was blinded a bit by its own light, or by the light of Bruce Springsteen's music. The main character is obsessed with Bruce Springsteen as a figure, and so it kind of feels like the film is also obsessed with Bruce Springsteen as a figure. But that contradicts the depiction of Bruce Springsteen's music that we get within the film. That's the mismatch that we're kind of pinpointing here, it seems like.
It's hard to say exactly what could have been done to make that better. I don't know the direction that I would have preferred to see. It's hard to say. It's just that kind of nagging feeling that you get knowing some background context on this.
Right, so if you haven't listened to Bruce Springsteen before you see this movie, which I really hadn't, you will come away, I think, more with the sense that you should listen to Bruce Springsteen because, dang, he's got some bops. And also you will have your attention drawn to the lurchiness of the narrative and the cliches that are present in how it plays out. And if you come at it as a pre-existing fan of Bruce Springsteen's, then there's a good chance that you will come away with it wondering why it didn't go quite far enough.
Right, why it didn't dive into the full complexity that it could have, and why it just seemed to, like you said, cherry pick what was important to make the film narratively work.
So what if you don't come at it from either of those angles? What if you just come at it as someone who is interested in watching the story of a Pakistani immigrant, his experience within the specific historical context of 1987 Britain is very heavily featured within the film. And then I think you could reasonably go into the film with that as your primary point of interest. So what are your feelings on
My feelings are, if you go in viewing it that way, the film is highly successful. I think the film was exceptionally good at balancing the line between universal teen angst and specific cultural aspects of being a Pakistani immigrant in the UK at that exact moment, right? We got to see specific events that happened, specific actions of hate against Muslim and Pakistani people, sprinkled constantly throughout the film. Like, to them, it wasn't hardly even a big deal because they'd seen it so many times. The exception being, right, the full-on NF march and the pig's head on the mosque.
Right. But even those things, I think, are quite effective, actually. I really...
No, they're very effective because they break us and the characters out of ignoring the hate and make us really see it, right? Make them forced to deal with it, and that's when it became really interesting.
Yeah, it's really in your face, especially the march that you're talking about, which is it's straight in the face of the characters too. They're marching, or they're driving in a procession towards the location of the wedding of Javed's sister, and then are literally halted by this protest that is happening by these white supremacists who are specifically advocating for the removal of immigrants, Pakistani immigrants, from Britain, and they have signs held up that
right, and they're
like, keep Britain white.
And they're a Britain united under a conservative rule at the time, so
that's something also that is alarmingly relevant and really gut punches you if you keep up with current events today, or even if you don't, you've probably heard about the various white supremacy movements that are gaining traction all around the United States and also extending out into Britain with a couple of years ago, UKIP founded, which was a party in Britain that was staunchly anti-immigrant, far-right to an extreme extent, and whose viewpoints echo that of the people that we see marching in the streets in this film.
Mm.
And that party has fallen in relevance a little bit over the past couple of years, but we still see that mindset very much present in the large-scale global politics today, which see populist nationalist movements rising all around the world. And it makes it kind of funny when Javed comments offhandedly at one point about how the United States is this promised land that takes all the best parts of Great Britain and ignores all the bad parts of it.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting that the dad had before that said that everything that was bad in the UK is worse in the United States, which honestly, both of those were probably true at the time, right? Because there are elements that are the best in the United States. And there are, especially at that time with the kind of celebrity president in Ronald Reagan, politically probably some of the worst that it's been.
Yeah, so in that way, Blinded by the Light feels relevant. Perhaps its overwhelming optimism is even dampened a little bit by the state of things at present when you take stock of that and see how very not far we have come.
It's strange, too, how focused Javed is on his own small circle of life and how focused he is on like his Bruce Springsteen fandom when it's also showing all these other things going on in the world, right? The politics in the United States, the politics in his specific community and in Britain as a whole.
There's the giant Thatcher billboard.
Yeah. But he's almost not even concerned with those elements, except for in his poetry, right? And his own personal discrimination.
His specific experiences.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think that we have to remember he's 16. Like, as a point of conjecture, perhaps that is all the more accurate in terms of someone living as a Pakistani immigrant in Britain during this time period at Javed's age would probably have been attuned more to the day-to-day struggles that they faced as a member of this suppressed minority group than they would have much in the way of like specific knowledge of the political machinations that are driving that discrimination.
Yeah.
Javed is a Pakistani immigrant, but also he's just a teenager, and teenagers are generally fairly egocentric and more concerned with their own experiences than those of the world.
You got a point, and it makes me think of probably my favorite scene in the whole movie, which is what I talked about earlier, where the tension between father and son finally collapses into a giant fight and argument. That probably has the most complex issues and personal issues combined into one scene. And Bruce Springsteen even is related to that. So it has the political, social,
Which
and
scene?
Bruce
Sorry.
Springsteen. Okay, it begins with the neighbor coming over and showing the family that Javed's article got in the paper.
Brief anecdote, another funny thing in the movie, that neighbor character who exists literally to pop up like 3 times in the movie and show the family cool things that Javed did.
Yeah. And
Did
also
they really
to
not-
initially clearly like give them a look because he's an old white man.
Yeah, like you think he's a Nazi at first.
And
It's
then
like,
he changes
it's a
quickly.
twist.
It's a twist.
It's a bit of a strange inclusion. It's like, could we really not come up with a better way to include those like 3 necessary pieces of information that he provides for
a
the
bit of
movie's narrative?
heavy-handedness there for sure. Anyway, so the scene continues, so the actual argument is the most interesting part because it begins by fusing the political and social issue with Javed's character in relation to his culture, which is him putting a voice on people that he culturally is the same as, but might not fully identify with. And his dad questions him on that. He's like, why are you speaking for essentially our people, right? That's shouldn't be what you're doing. We should be not telling our story and keeping our heads down. So it presents like this really cool multi-sided issue on it. And he is more interested in the personal aspect of it, which is getting on the front page, writing as a potential career in the future. And that then goes into their personal relationship because that was just the first layer of that. And it finally ends after the dad takes his Bruce Springsteen tickets and rips them up. Javed says, I don't want to be your son, So it puts all these great issues into one.
I hadn't really thought about the fact that the film totally glosses over the actual reporting work that Javed must have done with it was like a mosque bombing, or was it?
It was just defamation with
defamation.
the pig's head. The article, I think, was actually on the calls by neo-Nazis to shut it down.
Right. The reporter comes and grabs Javed and is like, oh, hey, like, you have some perspective on this and, like, speak some of their language, so can you come and report on this? And, like, maybe we'll give you a spot on the front page. And then it's not an issue for Javed in terms of what he's actually reporting on. He really just wants to get on the front page.
Exactly. So, but I thought, I mean, in that moment, the way it was presented was an effectively complex view of everything that was going on at the time, and even tied in the Bruce Springsteen element. So it was able to successfully segue into every aspect of the film that the rest of it probably wasn't able to combine as well.
Ultimately, in my mind, Blinded by the Light is a bit of a failed synthesis of a lot of different ideas. It doesn't always fail. It has scenes like the one you just described that for a few minutes manage to tie all of these ideas together in a way that feels genuine and effective, and a lot of scenes in between do not manage to do that and instead feel clunky for one reason or another, or shallow. So yeah, overall feelings on it?
Overall feelings is that there was definitely some enjoyment and a lot of things I liked, and ultimately it was a little lacking, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, obviously plenty that struck us and that led to some self-reflection and memories of our own experiences being brought to light, and some interesting contextualizing in terms of the world that we're living in now.
But honestly, the in total element that we didn't like about it, which is that overall it adhered so closely to a classic feel-good film and glossed over a lot of what we thought it should have talked about more, that's probably actually what appeals more to the general audience, right? Is that they know it's a feel-good film. It has a classic arc that we've seen before in movies, and so that's just an appealing aspect to the film, and that's probably why it's getting such good attention. Not great box office.
Yeah, that's the interesting thing, is it is not performing especially well. It almost feels like a family hit from 20 years ago, like a 90s movie.
Yeah, exactly, right. It feels like you've seen it before.
It's a bit of a missed opportunity in that respect. I think that the world is ready for something a little bit less glossy than this. What it's ultimately inhibited by is its strict adherence to the narrative beats that end up creating this story tied up in a pretty bow in a super cliched way.
Mm-hmm. Because, yeah, I mean, it's based on his life, so it must not have been that clean cut.
There's no way he gave that speech.
Yeah, no way. That's probably why it's only loosely based on the novel. Inspired
right, so actually,
by.
And actually it's his life, so...
Right, exactly. No, that's what I'm saying.
Autobiography.
Yeah.
Okay, that actually...
It could have been more realistic in presentation. In the final moments of the film, the tacked on end sequence, you know, with the pictures, they even say that Sarfraz Mansour has seen Bruce Springsteen over 150 times, so that was the key element besides his reconciliation and connection with his family. That was the key element that he wanted us to take away. Yeah, exactly. Which is unbelievably insane that you would go to see anyone that big 150 times.
Yeah.
I mean, think about the amount of money he must have spent.
Ludicrous amount of money.
That's true obsession.
That's true obsession, yeah. Yeah, weirdo. Blinded by the Light, not quite a profound exploration of the difficult issues that it touches upon, and also not quite a compelling, shallow experience that's just a feel-good story. It has its failings in both of those respects.
I'll admit, it's hard not just to write it off as, I liked it. Right? And that's probably why it's got such good reviews, is that it's fairly easy to just view it and say, yeah, I enjoyed it.
Yeah, I think everyone's wrong.
Everyone's, as per usual.
I've seen a lot of praise that has basically amounted to, how can you possibly dislike this movie? It's so cheery and likable, and like it's just infectious, and it like puts a smile on your face, and
it is, but that doesn't mean you can't critique it. Also,
yeah, it also doesn't mean that all the smiles that put on my face were not at the movie, because there's certain elements that are so ham-fisted that they're not even corny and lovable; they're just painfully stale.
Oh, the other end part that I wanted to mention is when they get in the car. the dad throws the keys to him and says, "You drive." And
Yeah.
then the dad puts in the already
Yeah.
rewound Springsteen tape right on second one to Born to Run.
Yeah.
And it ends the movie.
Yeah. Yeah, we get it. He was born to run.
Yeah.
He's running
Yeah, that was, I think, the
away.
third or fourth time we'd heard that same song in a movie celebrating all of Bruce Springsteen's music. So,
Supposedly.
yeah, supposedly.
Yeah. Sarfraz Manzoor, fake fan.
Fake fan.
150
right there.
concerts and he
That's
still doesn't
nothing.
listen to the back catalog.
Yeah, exactly.
No, just kidding. I do have a lot of affection for the affection that is displayed in this film.
Yeah.
But I also am not going to forgive the stuff that it does wrong.
It's hard for me, and I think you'll agree with this, it's hard for us to like a film where the ending is just so off. Like, there can be a handful of bad scenes in an otherwise great movie, but an ending has to hit for it to really connect with me.
My middle school English teacher told me that, man. He was like, yo, you start with your second to strongest point, then your middle paragraph, you stuff in your weakest stuff, and then last paragraph, you put your strongest material right at the end, right?
In movies nowadays, they don't do that at all. They make it all hit you at the beginning, so you stay through the whole thing.
Exactly. Yeah, shout out Mr. Ullman. You need to talk to some Hollywood screenwriters.
Yeah,
because
you can be making big bucks down there in LA.
big bucks. Or actually, this might have been shot over in Great Britain. Well, I think that is about everything we want to get across about Blinded by the Light tonight. I felt like we had some good talks about that. Gotten into some good material.
But tramps like us,
Baby.
maybe we were born to run. Yeah.
All right, I'm gonna go.
Yeah, bye.
No, yeah, that was. Oh, yikes! If there's anything you think we just missed with this film, or anything you disagree with,
hit us up on Facebook or Instagram
or even Twitter.
or
I
Twitter.
think we got 10 followers right now, so
Oh yeah.
if you're one of those 10, baby, reach out. And thank you very much for listening. Again, on social media, we're at About Movies CI.
Mm-hmm.
We will be back, of course, next week for a discussion on an undisclosed film. And I'll be listening to Bruce Springsteen in the time between now and then.
Yeah. As we all should. Every day for the rest of our lives.
The moral of the story. Beautifully said. All right, play us off, Corey.
Bye, everyone.